I'm enjoying the cool Irish summer. I mean, it's good weather for a data center. You know, you want to keep it cool. It's good to also talk about the cloud here. It's a privilege to be back here for the second time. It's also a privilege to share the podium again with Billy Hawkes, with whom I shared it last time, and congratulations on your reappointment. You know, there is no data protection commissioner anywhere in Europe who plays a more important role for us at Google than Billy, and so just wanted to say that if you care about someone who gives good, practical, concrete, pragmatic advice on data protection issues to a global company and have that company listen to it, nobody's doing that better than Billy, so thank you for that. I'm going to speak a little bit about the cloud and talk about both the technical framework and then also a little bit about the policy framework. Look, the point of the conversation is a very simple one. It's to say, you know, yes, we can protect privacy in the cloud, and yes, we can encourage, you know, the full benefits of the cloud for all of us, right? They're not incompatible goals. It just means we need to think about the privacy concerns that we have, the technical architecture, what elements of the policy framework still work, and what elements need to be updated for the new realities. And so that's what I'd like to outline here a little bit today. When people talk about the cloud, they usually talk about it in a kind of assimilated sense of a lot of different things. And I wanted to untangle some of those concepts just so we can be a little bit more analytically sharp about them. The cloud is an architecture. As people know, it's a physical architecture, right? It's a physical architecture composed of a number of different elements. One of them, perhaps the most, tangible, are data centers, right? It's one or a network of data centers, big or small, usually around the world, operated either in a proprietary fashion by a company or operated by third parties. We have had a data center, one of our major data centers here in Dublin for many years. I was joking, but really, a cool, moderate climate is a good place for data centers. So if you're thinking about competitive advantages on the global stage, Ireland is well suited for the age of cloud computing. But it's also the architecture of the wires. It's the architecture of end-user equipment that connects to it, relay stations and the like. And I'll come back to the significance of that physical architecture in the policy discussion in a minute. But the cloud's also a bunch of services, right? The cloud services that probably everyone in this room is the most historically familiar with are the consumer things, right? Like webmail services, Hotmail, Yahoo Mail, Gmail, and the like. And increasingly similar types of services being offered to businesses and governments. We call them Google Apps, where you can have webmail, documents, calendaring services, and the like offered to institutions and governments for the kinds of efficiency that they bring. It's also platforms. And of course, it's social networking sites that have been talked about quite a bit in privacy circles recently. And finally, the cloud is just a different model of computing, right? It's a paradigm shift where computing previously happened pretty much on the machine that was at your fingertips to a new model where the computing, not just the storage of documents, but the computing itself is happening remotely, right? It's happening off on the server of the cloud provider. And the only computing software that you really need to use locally is the browser. So that's a fundamental shift in computing architecture. It's something that Google is very committed to being part of this paradigm shift. I think it will explain a lot of the very dramatic changes that you'll be seeing in the future. We're certainly behind our focus on launching a browser with Chrome. It was to build a browser specifically for this type of environment, and over time you may see that extend into a lot of other areas as well that I'm really not here to talk about today, but I think you can guess. I want to outline very briefly some principles for privacy, and these are the principles, as I see it, that define how privacy remains protected in the cloud architecture. They're not necessarily an exclusive list. I'm not purporting to do that. It's just the things that, to me, seem really important, that are kind of changing, the principles are sort of changing that we need to think about. And give some examples of a few things that are working well, or at least attempts to make things work well, and a few other examples where the things are a complete muddle. And we have some of both. The first is, when people raise concerns about the cloud from a privacy point of view, one of the things that one commonly hears is, well, there's just so much data, right? Or you're entrusting all of your data, all your emails to this third-party cloud provider, like a Google or somebody else, and that inherently is a privacy problem. And of course, there is a lot of data. I mean, that is the whole nature of cloud computing, right? It's the remote storage of data. And that brings with it a lot of responsibilities and issues we can talk about in a few minutes. But one thing that it also enables is a level of transparency and user control that was never possible before. So we're using the same power of the cloud to give users real transparency and control over their own data in a way that wasn't possible before. Now, put it into data protection terms, everybody knows that subject access requests, right, has been a fundamental tenet of data protection for decades. But the reality is that it was very rarely used. I mean, it was like one of those rights that exist theoretically. Any of us could do a subject access request to a controller that holds personal data about ourselves and be entitled to a response. The problem is in the past that just wasn't really working very well. Only a tiny, tiny number of people would ever exercise the right. What they would get back from these different companies was highly arbitrary and probably not very helpful. In the cloud, you really can move to a model of complete transparency because you can architect the system to show a user all of the data. I mean, every single piece of data, every single thing that you hold. Now, think about it in the most basic sense. It's almost like, your Gmail account or your webmail account. You can see all your own emails if you keep them in the system. There they are. You can prioritize them, you can organize them any way you like. We can do this at a broader scale for any use of cloud services. And so we've done this in two examples, and I won't dwell on the examples because this is more of a policy-focused talk, but one of them is in the space of third-party advertising. And we have now a site called the Ads Preference Manager, which I'd encourage you to just type into your machine, when you're back at your leisure. And what it will do, it'll automatically read the cookie number on your machine if you're in the network and show you a personalized page that says, with this cookie number, we've associated the following interest categories according to which ads are being shown to you. I mean, that was a breakthrough level of transparency. Nobody had been doing that before. It also lets people then to say, hey, no, you put me in the category of sports. I actually want to be in the category of travel or whatever, or just opt out entirely if that's what you want to do. I looked at my own the other day. I was thinking about throwing up a slide with my own, but I thought it made me look like such a geek because it said he's interested in public policy and news events, and that's it. And I thought, gee, I was like, I thought even I can't put that up. It's like the dashboard is another example where if you're a Google account user, so with any Google services that you have a password, you can now see all the data associated with your account, and you can keep it, delete it, move it to a third service provider if that's what you want to do. So those are pretty good examples. I'm not saying that these are the full examples, just some positive ideas about how to use cloud architecture for privacy. That's a positive. A more troubling one, from the point of view of a company operating in this space, is what law applies. Right? What law applies? I mean, today we have a very contradictory maze, but both at a European and also in particular at a global level. Why? Because we have so many different legal regimes for privacy that are based on very different theories. One theory could be the law of the country in which the controller is organized, or it could be the law in which the user is located, or it could be the place where you use equipment, and then you can debate what is a piece of equipment. Is it just the use of a cookie, for example? That's been a position taken by many leaders in the privacy field in Europe. So if you look at the different types of services, you can come up with a model where essentially everybody is claiming jurisdiction over every cloud service everywhere, right, according to one theory or another. And without debating, who should regulate the cloud, one thing just very practically from the point of view of a company, it does present a sort of conundrum, right? Well, what exactly is it that we're supposed to do, and who exactly is deciding that? If something is very local, it's no problem. You just do it locally and follow whatever the local rules are. But if you're talking about global networks, if you're talking about global architectures, it's just not really possible. And that's something that over time, I think we're either going to have to move towards a more harmonized set of rules, I'll come back to that in a minute, or alternatively, we're just going to have to come up with some set of rules about who gets to make these decisions. Finally, on the problem space, and I'll come to some solutions. Another thing that people talk about in privacy concerns a lot relating to the cloud is, well, if I store my data remotely with you, cloud provider, doesn't that mean a government, for good or ill, can go to the cloud provider and get my data, right? And in a sense, that's true. I mean, if they follow local rules, and if the cloud provider is subject to jurisdiction, and if the procedures are followed, the answer is yes. But there's been very little transparency on this field up till now, and there still is far less. But one thing we launched, and you can look at that later if you're interested, is a page called Government Requests. It's something we launched a few months ago, which shows an interactive map of the world with the number of government requests that we get for user data by country. It's interactive. It'll be updated every 6 months. We want 6-month windows so that the data is meaningful. There's no point in doing it day to day because it would just fluctuate too much. And if you look at that, it just tells you some interesting things. It just tells you in very rough terms which governments tend to be accessing the most data that users are holding in the cloud. I was surprised to see that Brazil was the #1 country in the world. I would never have guessed that before we did our own study. US was second, the UK was third. But that's the kind of thing that, and because it's simply neutral and agnostic, it's not saying that the access requests are inappropriate or illegitimate. On the contrary, they may be quite legitimate, after all, government policing powers. But it's important for users, I think, to have some sense of what's going on. That's all, transparency on these issues. So this is a first attempt. We do the same thing for censorship, if you're interested in that, so takedown of content requests. Again, not saying it's not appropriate, but it's interesting to see which governments are asking for content to come down the most. High on the list for us, for example, is Germany, with the much more stringent rules that Germany has around neo-Nazi and Holocaust denialist content. So again, not inappropriate, but the numbers are there to back it up. And finally, there's more conversation about what exactly should the security breach notification thresholds be around the world for the cloud. But now I want to get into the real kind of policy nitty-gritty, because I think most of the people in the room, I know some of you are policy wonks like myself, and like to think about which pieces of this work. And of course, I'm speaking to this strictly from the point of view of a company guy who's just trying to make the stuff work internally. So it's a very practical approach. And I'm not saying this as a politician or a privacy advocate or anything else. So this is just sort of like, well, even if you agree with this, just how's it all supposed to work kind of thing. These are the ones that strike me as the most problematic for the cloud. And when I look at these, I say that many of these are Euro-specific issues. So these are not issues in public policy regulating the cloud globally. These are, to some extent, artifacts that derive from either the EU Data Protection Directive of 1995, or in some cases from concepts that are even older, that go back to the 70s. So in other words, these are very much Euro data protection concepts. And I want to be really clear, I've spent many years working with Euro data protection concepts. I'm not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. What I'm suggesting is that there are just certain things that have become a little obsolete. Time to freshen up. Now, my absolute favorite, or least favorite, concept in all of European data protection think is the fact that so much of it is based on the location of data, right? I mean, if you really start to think about what privacy practitioners spend a lot of their time doing in contorting themselves and their companies into data protection compliance, the #1 source of that problems are rules that are trying to regulate privacy based on the location of data. Now, when these concepts were invented, they made a lot of sense, right? Data had a sort of physical component. It was, on a piece of paper, sitting in a file cabinet. You could say that the important thing for regulating privacy was when it moved from this place to that place. In other words, you were trying to regulate the concept of the substance of privacy, but you used the physical data concept as an approximation of it. And the cloud, that makes no sense at all. It makes absolutely, absolutely no sense. First of all, data isn't physical, right? Data is a completely disembodied thing now, as electrons and magnetic waves and so on, depending on what systems you use. Also, in terms of location on the cloud, it exists in multiple and constantly changing locations, even in this disembodied form, right? I mean, for I think most cloud providers, they keep it on at least 2 large repositories in case, for example, you lose power in one. Things will move location all the time for efficiency purposes. One data center is busy based on the time of day. Another part of the world has gone to sleep and it's not busy. Things will move around constantly. So that the idea that data either has a location or that you even know where it is would dictate the kind of privacy rules that apply to it just simply makes no sense. And yet that is what we have by and large. Now, to be really clear, I'm not at all suggesting that you can't have just an effective privacy regime governing data on the cloud. Of course you can. You just don't base it on the location of data as an artifice. You base it on other ideas. Canadian model, I think, is quite strong in this space. It's the accountability model. It's if you're the controller, Google, Amazon, whoever you are, and you hold this data, you're responsible for protecting it. I mean, that makes a lot of sense to me, right? And that responsibility to protect it doesn't change because data might be zipping across a few borders along the way. The controller processor model, I don't know how many of you have ever actually looked at something like a model contract for controller processor transfer. I'm sorry to say I've spent a lot of time looking at them. And you know, they're an attempt to sort of deal again with the data transfer issue and the controller processor model. The problem is that, again, they weren't designed for the cloud, so they don't really fit the cloud. I'll give a couple examples currently. We could have a new model of the controller processor thing that was designed specifically for the cloud. We should develop that, right, and as a policy framework. But the current model doesn't. And I get these things every day from potential cloud customers, or more often from the lawyers of potential cloud customers who say, well, how is this supposed to work, right? Because this agreement says, for example, the model framework that you're supposed to use says things like, well, as a controller, meaning the company that wants to use the cloud service, let's say, you know, the department store down the street, you must, by law, exercise a right of audit when you use a cloud processor like Google. Well, you know, it's all fine to sort of use appropriate care. You know, that's a classic legal concept, of course, in choosing your cloud provider. But when you sort of force people to sort of take the responsibility for auditing, and you do that for, you know, literally hundreds of thousands of cloud users, all of whom are supposed to audit Amazon, I don't even know what that means. I seriously do get questions about, does that mean they're supposed to visit a data center? What does that mean? What do you know? So a way forward could be to say things like, well, why don't we just come up with internationally recognized and adopted thresholds that would be generally recognized as representing compliance, like, you know, certification. ISO certification is one example. And one of the ways that we could do this, possibly, is have something like a binding corporate role for the cloud, but not the binding corporate roles that we have today that have to get approved by, you know, 27 or umpteen regulators, and they all just sort of, you know, end up sitting in piles and never get worked on. I don't think there's ever been a binding corporate role approved anywhere in Europe for a cloud provider. I think I saw a former commissioner mention a statistic to me that was interesting. He said that even though there have been about 5 years of binding corporate role work done in the privacy community, that the percentage of multinationals who'd successfully completed it, and we're assuming all multinationals do international data transfers, is about 1 in a million. I mean, it's a sad statistic, right? But I mean, it is a wake-up call. It's like, really, the solution has worked for 1 in a million. It means the solution is not working. And, you know, finally, on applicable law and what law should apply and then who should apply it. Applicable law today is such a maze to try to deal with that you can take one of two approaches. You can either say, well, I'm going to ignore the whole legalistic debate and try to come up with a kind of common denominator that sort of works around the world or around Europe, and you can try. And you can say, here's sort of roughly how it will work, and it won't have perhaps every little bell and whistle that might be imagined or required in every particular country, but generally you come up with a common denominator. And that is basically how the industry works, right? It has always worked, because there's no other choice. That's essentially how it has to work. Or you can come down to a kind of balkanization of the web, where you just sort of have a world where, you know, the cloud, theoretically, if it could, splinters. And I think if it did that, we would lose all these benefits of efficiency and, you know, the global architecture that has been so useful for the cloud and why the cloud is going to work very well. It's imaginable. I think we'll see some balkanization of the cloud in the years ahead. I think probably not in, you know, the rule of law countries of the world, but we'll probably see the temptation to do that in particular in the countries less committed to rule of law. But it can be done, and I think it will be done. And, you know, that is one of the sort of stresses that we'll see in this space, you know, over the next few years. As far as I'm concerned, you know, the solution here is obvious, which doesn't mean that it isn't hard. The obvious solution is, you know, we do need to come up with something like global privacy standards in this space. Because if we don't, we'll just spend basically forever debating jurisdiction, debating applicable law, contorting ourselves into attempts to comply with these divergences as best or as poorly as can be done. And I think, you know, it is quite reasonable to think that these various initiatives that are underway in the world today will continue to evolve and move in that direction. What are they, right? We already have the OECD updating its framework. We have the EU reconsidering the 95 directive. We have APEC having made a lot of progress in its work. We have the so-called Madrid resolution led by a number of data protection commissioners from around the world with other stakeholder involvement. All these different initiatives and groups have come up with not identical, but largely converging sort of frameworks that we can call global privacy standards, if you will. Even the US now has omnibus privacy legislation working its way through Congress, which is a sea change in the political debate about privacy in the US as well. So I think as we see, you know, more of the cloud, the internet in general, but the cloud in particular, we'll kind of like force the debate. We'll force people to say, look, if we really want to get our arms around this set of problems, the best way to do it is to sort of push to this more converged vision of global privacy standards. And I know Billy has been a leader in one of the initiatives that was formerly named the Galway Project to work it into that direction, but has now become renamed the Paris Project. Is that? Yeah, well, I will make no sort of macroeconomic statements about the naming or renaming of that project, but the idea, nonetheless, is a very good one, which is that you know, we can come up with an accountability framework that is generally recognized as being meaningful and supporting things around the way. So I'll pass the podium on to Billy, and then I know we'll have an opportunity for a more general conversation after that. Thank you.